Of all the different types of places on Earth, prisons, places I've never had much interest in visiting, especially the ones on this list. Today I'm counting down some of the worst prisons in history, with such poor conditions and an overabundance of violence that visiting was simply ill-advised. So much so that they just had to be shut down. Anyone in the audience interested in venturing into one of these prisons, let me know down below. I'm your host James, and these are the top 10 prohibited prisons on Earth the CIA warned you not to visit. We're starting off this list with the Shepton Mallet Prison. So we're going to be talking a lot about brutal prisons that you would have been warned not to visit before they were finally shut down. So I figured I'd start things off with a prison that is no longer operational, but you may still not want to visit for another reason. Ghosts. Located in Somerset, England, Shepton Mallet is known as one of the most haunted prisons in the world and has a long storied history. It had completed construction in 1910 and was fully operational until 1990 and had changed hands several times over the course of its operation. It was a military prison in both British and American hands during World War II and then went back to British hands after that. The walls of this historic building are said to house the tortured spirits that were once inmates of the prison, where countless hangings took place. There are ghost tours now. If you want to go at your own risk. Next on the list, we have the West Virginia Penitentiary, also known as the Moundsville Penitentiary. This was a maximum security prison located in Moundsville, West Virginia. The prison operated from 1876 to 1995, notorious for its brutal living conditions. Something that will be a running theme on the list was the prison's issues with overcrowding. For a prison that was supposed to only hold 480 inmates, 2,000 prisoners at times, probably a little much. Obviously, the cells were cramped. There was also no air conditioning or heating, but honestly, with the amount of inmates packed into the place, heating may have been the last thing anyone would have wanted. It was one of the most violent and dangerous prisons in the United States. It was plagued by riots and murders. In 1986, a major riot broke out, which brought national attention to the deplorable conditions of the prison. So, as a result of the riots and ongoing safety concerns, the West Virginia Penitentiary was finally shut down in 1995. But definitely not a place you would have been advised to go to before that. The Ohio State Reformatory, also known as the Mansfield Reformatory, was a correctional facility located in Mansfield, Ohio. The facility was operational from 1896 to 1990, and over the course of its operation, the conditions became notoriously poor and inhumane, which eventually led to its closure. The facility was overcrowded, which led to unsanitary living conditions. Multiple inmates were crammed into cells that were only meant for 2 people. The lack of space also meant that some prisoners had to sleep on the floor. And I don't know about you, I've never seen a prison with a comfy carpeted floor. These conditions were made even worse by the inhumane treatment of the inmates. Physical abuse was common among guards. Inmates were also subject to psychological abuse, including prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. In the 1970s, a federal court declared the conditions of the reformatory were just inhumane and ordered, changes to be implemented. But these changes were just too slow to come, and it was just a little too late. It was finally shut down in 1990. Eastern State Penitentiary, located in Philadelphia, was designed to be this new and revolutionary model for a prison when it first opened in 1829. Each inmate would be isolated in their own cell, unable to communicate with other inmates. They had a small exercise yard attached to their cell, and they also had a skylight. Inmates spent 23 hours a day in their cells, with only 1 hour for exercise in the yard, which was also enclosed so that inmates couldn't see or communicate with each other. The cells were deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. They had a single hard bench and a toilet that was visible to guards at all times. Conditions pretty harsh. Over time, the prison also became overcrowded, with more and more inmates inmates becoming crammed into the small cells. This led to a decline in the quality of life for the prisoners, which was already pretty not great, and the conditions became increasingly unsanitary and unsafe. Riots and violence were common, and the guards struggled to just maintain control over all the inmates. After 142 years of operation, the prison finally closed in 1971. Alright, so this is a German word. In German, I don't speak it, so this might come out a little janky. Hohenschönhausen Prison is a former Stasi prison located in Berlin, Germany. It was originally built in 1945, but in 1951, the Soviet secret police transferred control of the facility to the Eastern German Ministry of State Security, commonly known as the Stasi. Used it as a prison for opponents of the regime. The prison just had terrible living conditions, and the inmates were treated, of course, horribly, as you could probably imagine. They were subjected to physical violence, forced labor, but psychological torture was the main method used here. They would threaten to harm inmates' families. Sleep deprivation was also big. They were held in cramped cells without windows and were often denied food and medical treatment. Many inmates were interrogated for weeks or months on end, often resulting in false confessions. Despite the human rights abuses in the prison, the facility remained hidden from the public for many years. It was located in a restricted area, so this is one you definitely wouldn't be visiting because there's a good chance you wouldn't have even known it existed. Inmates were not allowed to communicate with the outside world and were often held in solitary confinement to prevent them from sharing information about their treatment. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Next on the list, Alcatraz, aka The Rock, was known for its harsh conditions, and the prison became infamous for the brutal treatment of its inmates. Inmates were often crammed, again, into tiny windowless cells with no ventilation. The medical care was also minimal, and the food was as notoriously bad as the notorious prisoners housed within the facility. I imagine that's most prisons, though. I've been alive for a good amount of time now, and when it comes to prison food, never heard good things. It's like meals you get on airplanes or hospitals. Every hack comedian across the globe just has a field day with how bad they are. It's just kind of an accepted known thing. The prison was also plagued by violence and, of course, overcrowding. Inmates were frequently attacked and abused by other prisoners, and there were several incidents of riots and escape attempts. The most famous of these was the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946. 6 inmates attempted to escape and were taken out in a violent standoff with guards. Finally, in 1963, the prison was closed due to its high operating costs and the deteriorating condition of the buildings. At number 4, we have the Kwang Central Prison. This one is actually still operational, although there are some particularly harsh practices that have been banned. It's still advised to veer as clear from this place as possible, though it's pretty horrific. Located in the outskirts of Bangkok, Thailand, this prison was built to house exceptionally dangerous offenders, a good number of which are on death row. For the first 3 months of an inmate's sentence, they were chained to leg irons, and those awaiting death row were welded into them permanently until they were finally executed. But that practice has since been banned. It's one of the most infamous prisons in Asia. It was given the nickname Big Tiger, which perfectly describes how the prison seems to consume the inmates, almost like a death factory. Next up, we have Carandiru Penitentiary. Carandiru Penitentiary was one of the largest and most infamous prisons in Brazil until it was demolished in 2002. Prison was designed to house 4,000 inmates, but often had more than double that number. So obviously you had severe overcrowding, and I can only imagine how unsanitary the conditions must have been, but I don't really want to. The prison lacked basic necessities like, adequate food, clean water, proper medical care. So not only were inmates in these crowded living conditions, but there was disease and malnutrition to deal with. So anyone in their right mind would have clearly warned you never to go near this place. In 1992, there was a mass massive riot at the prison. 111 inmates died, and it all apparently started over a game of football. In addition to the lack of basic necessities, the prison was also known to have pretty brutal guards. Inmates were subjected to physical and psychological torture. The use of solitary confinement was also rampant, and prisoners could be locked in cramped dark cells for weeks or even months at a time. Despite repeated calls for, changes, little was done to improve conditions at the prison. It was finally closed in 2002. La Sabaneta Prison, located in Zulia, Venezuela, was pretty notorious for being about as corrupt and deplorable as a prison can possibly be. Reports of torture, extortion, and violence were common in this prison, with gangs and criminal groups controlling most of the prison's activities. In fact, they basically ran the whole prison. It was a prison run by prisoners, like one step away from escape from New York. Inmates were often forced to pay protection fees to these groups in order to receive basic necessities like food and water, and it was just, again, plagued by corruption. Guards and officials often taking bribes to turn a blind eye to the kind of illegal activities of the inmates. Due to the horrific conditions at La Sabaneta Prison, human rights groups and the United Nations started calling for its closure. So no doubt members of the CIA would have urged you not to visit this place. In 2013, the Venezuelan government finally announced plans to shut down the prison and transfer the inmates to other facilities. The decision had come after this massive riot happened where over 50 people lost their lives. Holmesburg Prison. This one has quite the nickname, the Terror Dome. That is so dystopian sounding, it's not even funny. It sounds like something right out of Mad Max or something. And turns out, kinda was. This place didn't just get the intimidating nickname for nothing. The Terror Dome was home to countless dangerous scientific experiments conducted on the inmates. It's hard to believe some of this stuff actually happened. It's completely inhumane. The experiments were run by a dermatologist named Dr. Albert Kligman, who is this living embodiment of a mad scientist. The inmates did volunteer to be experimented on, but that's because there were small sums of money involved. A lot of them were desperate and they didn't really know the full extent or ramifications of these experiments. He tested all kinds of things on inmates. He exposed them to microwave radiation, infected them with various skin diseases. He performed several biochemical experiments like exposure to dioxin, for example. This is a substance used in Agent Orange, so not good. Kligman described how he felt when he first entered the prison and is quoted saying, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." Very, very sickening stuff. With all that said though, I've been your host, James, and I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.